new director of the NCRCRD, and welcome to this webinar. Today we have a webinar titled Building Community Capacity Through Strategic Planning. Ann Silvis and Becky Nesbitt are the presenters, and Ann is at the University of Illinois Extension, where she serves as Assistant Dean and Program Leader for Community Economic Development. Becky is at Ohio State University Extension, and she is an Assistant Professor and Educator in Community Development. I've got a little summary here of the webinar that I'll read, and then I'll hand it off to Ann and Becky. So here's the description. To evaluate the extent to which extension strategic planning practices vary across and within states, researchers from the U of I and Ohio State did a series of investigations to determine how and with what groups strategic planning is currently being executed, what procedures or components of procedures are being used, and if they are being used similarly throughout extension, and how outcomes are being measured, how data are being collected, documented, and shared, what materials are being used to facilitate strategic planning, and how to practice, how to strengthen Extension's role in empowering communities and organizations through strategic planning processes. So I'm really looking forward to the webinar. Ann and Becky, it's all yours. Oh, one other comment.
I
think most of you, just one last thing. There is a chat session here, so if you're not familiar with the webinar framework, if you do have questions, feel free to go ahead and write them there, and we can follow up with those questions along the way or at the end. Okay, so I'll get out of the way now.
Thanks again, Mark. This is Becky. A little bit later in the presentation, you're going to hear from Ann. The project that we are going to be talking about today, Building Community Capacity Through Strategic Planning, was funded, of course, by an $18,000 grant from the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development through their Small Grants program. Ann and I were part of a team of colleagues within our organization. So from University of Illinois Extension, in addition to Ann, the team included Kathy Brown, an Extension educator in Community and Economic Development, and Corey Buttry, who also worked in Community Development. Corey has since moved on to a position in Seattle, Washington. And so in addition to me, the OSU Extension team included Greg Davis, a professor and assistant director for Community Development, and Rose Fisher-Merkowitz, a former associate professor and extension educator for community development. Rose is currently OSU Emeriti as she retired from extension last July. So I wanted to talk for a moment about the purpose of the study. Strategic planning is a process that is pretty familiar to extension folks. For many years, we've employed a strategic planning process to help community and organization leaders think about the future and build an intentional route to achieving whatever their desired outcomes might be. We've also used it within our own organizations to navigate the changing landscape of things like funding and staffing, technology, and to help us focus more on impact-driven type development. But as often happens when you have a lot of different people using the same program in this sort of widespread implementation, the practices have become quite varied and diverse. And when our team began talking about strategic planning resources or curriculum, we realized that even within our own organizations, very little information exists about the resources, the practices, or the evaluation procedures that are used to collect data and measure the impact of our strategic planning efforts with groups and communities. Throughout these grant efforts, we wanted to learn a bit more about those things, so we surveyed and we talked to our extension colleagues from many states to identify the strategic planning practices that they might be using with their groups and communities. So specifically, as you can see on the slide, these are some of the questions that we wanted to address. How are our colleagues engaging in external groups in the strategic planning process? What materials or resources are used to facilitate that process? Are folks measuring outcomes or impacts, and if so, how are they collecting and measuring this information? And finally, how can we most effectively use strategic planning to strengthen Extension's role in making a positive impact on communities and organizations? So to answer those questions, we began with focus group discussions that were held with participants at the 2014 NACDUP annual meeting in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The information that we gained from those discussions helped guide our literature review and the examination of the scholarly work that focused on strategic planning practices, data collection, and outcomes. We followed that with a web-based survey asking folks to share information about their training and the preparation that they go through to learn to facilitate strategic planning. We also wanted to know about the methods that they use to conduct and process and measure and evaluate the outcomes and the impacts. And then all of that, of course, were followed after we looked at that and distilled all of that information with some recommendations that we'll share with you in a bit. So I'm going to turn it over to Anne so she can share a bit more information about the focus group discussions.
Thanks, Becky, and thank you for doing the introduction so well. Becky and I were very pleased to be able to work with several of our colleagues on this project, so I'm grateful to Becky for listing all of them, and of course want to give them credit for all the work that they did on the project. And Becky mentioned Corey Buttry, who worked with us, and he's the person who organized those focus groups and did most of the work on the project. So if there are any questions, any really hard questions, we're just going to say we don't know because Corey's not here anymore. But we're really grateful for all the creative work that he did on the project. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the focus group discussion topics that we addressed. This came out of the discussions that we had on the project team where we focused on what are people actually using, how are they preparing for strategic planning projects, what kind of materials are they using, what would be useful, what's missing, and then how are we evaluating that work and reporting. So it really did have a nice tie-in back to the work that we do as extension educators. And we thought that, of course, it has national significance, too, because one of the important roles that we feel Extension plays in community development, community planning, is helping communities and organizations do this kind of planning. So we focused our group discussions around 4 topical sections, and those were centered around 5 elements of strategic planning processes. And those were current practices, what are people doing now, engagement, how do you bring people into the process, resources, challenges, and evaluating success. So when we, to find out what our colleagues were doing currently, we asked questions such as, what types of strategic planning efforts have you been engaged with? What are you using? And you can see the kinds of questions that we use to guide those focus group discussions. And when we were thinking about how people bring stakeholders into the process, we asked questions such as, what are your planning steps before you begin the strategic planning process? Although one could argue that working with stakeholder groups is not actually prior to planning, it's part of planning, we thought that's probably how people address that topic. When we thought about what guides the planning processes, we asked questions such as, are there particular references or resources that you frequently turn to as you prepare for strategic planning with a community or organization? What are the sources that you use? Have you adapted these resources or developed your own resources? So we really used these general questions and prompts to get to a level of detail that we thought would be useful in evaluating what kind of resources are people actually using. And then to find out what challenges our colleagues face when they engage with a partner to plan, we asked, what have been your greatest challenges in conducting strategic planning processes? So that was an open-ended question that fostered a lot of discussion in the focus groups, and we really let people cover all the bases with what they were struggling with as they engaged in those planning processes. So this gives you a sense of the kinds of questions that we asked during those focus group discussions. And if any of you are interested in seeing hard copy or looking at the questions we used, we're happy to send those out to you. Just send us an email. Send me or Becky an email. We'll be happy to share that with you. So what did we learn in these focus groups? We'll give you a little summary of topics we covered. So if we go back and do a closer look at the topics we covered, that first topic, marketing, strategic planning, facilitation skills, how are people letting others know that Extension does strategic planning? And probably not surprising to you, the most common and useful strategy is word of mouth. That's the most common for marketing extension programs, strategic planning. And usually there was kind of a snowball effect where working with one group enabled us to make connections and work with subsequent groups. And then overall, participants really wanted to improve and expand our strategic planning programming efforts, and marketing our abilities and programs in this area was seen as one important way to do that. I think that one of the important distinctions that became evident as we talked with people about the strategic planning work they did is the delineation between our work in helping communities in their planning process, but not taking total responsibility for completing a plan for them. Oftentimes, the expectation from that community group is that we are functioning as consultants and we're going to do everything from identifying stakeholders to writing the plan. But the groups we talked with, and Becky and I are, the experience we have in our states supports this, is that we're most effective when we guide communities through the process and we don't take full responsibility for writing that plan or identifying and bringing all the stakeholders to the group. So those were some of the challenges that people faced when they were in that planning process. The second topic that we explored was how do you develop and improve your skills, not only in the strategic planning process, but in facilitating that process. So participants reported a lot of ways that they had learned how to do the facilitation with groups when they do strategic planning. They act as observers in ongoing projects. They attend workshops to develop their skills. They practice and get feedback. They also learn by teaching others. But many people noted how important it was to have some training in addition to learning the materials, having some experience and practice, and also how dangerous they felt it was to send someone out fresh or inexperienced who could maybe follow a process but not deal with the unexpected questions or situations that might come up when you're engaged in that process. The third topic that we explored was what kind of resources people are using for as they prepare for strategic planning. And we're going to compare your experience with what we found out in the focus groups. So we have a poll to ask you which of these most popular strategic planning resources you're using. What people said they were using most frequently was the Facilitator's Guide to Participatory Decision Making. We use that when we do facilitation training, so it's one that really focuses more on managing group process and facilitating. And then the other one that was very popular was Bryson's classic book on strategic planning. So both of those were well-used and popular resources in our study. So I see that you guys are all familiar with that too. Looks like many of you are using these two resources. Now, to continue that thought, if you have other resources that you are finding useful, if you put those in the chat box, we'll share those with everybody on the call. Maybe something that you have that you've used, even if it's very targeted, might be useful for the group to see too. The fourth topic that we addressed in these discussions was the challenges in evaluating the impact of our work. So there's some problems, as you can expect, that oftentimes the outcomes are not quantifiable. They're difficult to measure, difficult to get people to circle back and give you feedback on what it is that they accomplished. So there's just that kind of difficulty measuring intangible outcomes. Sometimes people didn't have time to do what they felt was adequate evaluation. So they know things changed, but they didn't go back and quantify those. And also, if you're looking back person by person, these groups change over time. So it may be that the people you started with are not all the people that you end up with, and so change is difficult to measure there too. So this list really wasn't surprising to us when we looked at it, but it should be alarming in that if we as extension professionals are not able to measure impact at the community or at least the organizational level, then we're missing out on telling an important story of success and relevance in the work we do. So we have to be careful that we're not just measuring outputs as in numbers of participants at community meetings or people attending meetings or whatnot. Much less effective than if we could measure the outcomes, which would be the value of the plans developed and the progress toward implementation of those plans. So we need to work really hard to measure and claim credit for that work, despite the fact that it's difficult. It serves us well to focus on this. For those of you in the North Central region, one of our North Central regional indicators is about the working with communities and planning. And the measure is plans developed and then progress toward completion of those plans. So even if a community doesn't act on and fulfill all aspects of the plan in one reporting year, you can measure their progress toward those goals and count that as your own outcome. So we put in another poll, and that is the one about whether or not you've had experience and difficulty with strategic planning, or if you've had experience facilitating a strategic planning process. So give you a second to log in your votes on that. So it looks like we have kind of a mix. Some of you who have no experience facilitating it, maybe that's why you're here. I should stop telling you how difficult it is. Some of you have participated in strategic planning but not facilitated it, and then many of you have facilitated strategic planning. So that's good. We have an experienced audience. And when we talked to people in the focus groups, one of the things that they thought was most valuable in how to do a good job in strategic planning, working with others, either co-teaching or co-facilitating. So it's great to see that so many of you have experience. You're there to help your colleagues. We also conducted a literature review as part of the work that we did, just to kind of ground this and understand what are people able to look at, what information is available. So we used a few key terms: strategic planning, strategic doing, community decision-making, participatory planning, community planning, community visioning, connective leaders, and strategy execution. So in identifying these key terms that we used in the literature review really was eye-opening because we thought, wow, we're doing something and calling it a lot of different names, so that could be part of the challenge in figuring out what kind of resources will best serve our efforts. So part of our challenge is the language. But when we look at what we learned in that summary, one, the definitions of strategic planning differ from author to author, and they differ over time and by context too. But when you look at all of it together, most authors agree that these four components are crucial, that the process really looks towards the future. It includes the creation of a vision, and that emphasis on the future is ongoing throughout the process. Secondly, the planning process must incorporate internal considerations and the external forces of the environment. That's traditional strategic planning. Look at where you are and what might affect your ability to achieve the vision going forward. Effective communication is necessary, and I think that's why people kept saying that the facilitation skills were crucially important as they worked with communities and organizations to do strategic planning. Communication between the facilitator and the group, and the facilitator's ability to enhance communication within the group. Sometimes that's one of our most important roles. And then finally, any number of processes can be used effectively. There's no one right planning process. There's no one right magic, effective, all-purpose solution. So that is maybe one reason why people find it so necessary to practice and to learn alongside someone who has some experience, because oftentimes this is an art of working with a group, of adjusting your plan to their needs and making sure that what you're doing still has relevance to that group. So now we're going to move on to the survey of extension professionals, and I'm going to hand it back to Becky to talk about the survey.
Well, we developed a web-based survey that was sent to program leaders in the North Central region, and we asked those folks to forward it on to their colleagues who work in strategic planning and facilitate those processes. We also surveyed the Regional Development Center directors as well as other program leaders across the country who'd been identified as having a significant amount of experience in strategic planning. We had 81 extension professionals complete the survey. 49 of those indicated that they work in community and economic development. But we had folks from the other program areas who also responded. We had about 6% in 4-H and youth development. 25% of those folks who responded identified themselves as working primarily in ag and food science. 12% said they work in natural resources, 5% in family and consumer sciences, and about 6% of the folks work mainly in leadership development. Add those numbers up quickly, you'll see that they add up to more than 100%, and that's because we allowed folks to select more than one program area if they had a primary responsibility in more than one. So about 3/4 of the respondents said that they have at least some experience in facilitating a strategic planning process. And as you can see by the statistic on the slide, 76% of those who responded to the survey said that their customers or clientele expect them to have the skills necessary to guide a group through that planning process. And as we saw earlier in the poll, about 80% of the folks just on the webinar here have experience in strategic planning facilitation. We also asked folks to tell us about the strategic planning paradigms that they like to use when working with groups or communities. So what's the framework of the strategic planning process that they like to employ? So the ones that were most often cited included using a SWOT or a SOAR to help folks examine the internal strengths and weaknesses and the external opportunities or threats. Now SOAR takes a little bit of a different approach, asking participants to examine strengths, opportunities, aspirations, and results. Also cited was asset-based development considers local or organizational assets as sort of primary building blocks of sustainable growth and development. Appreciative inquiry, which is a strengths-based approach to change and development, was also mentioned many times. But the paradigm that was mentioned was John Bryson's model. And the Bryson model is a pretty traditional approach, having participants evaluate their current status, so where are they now, and then they envision where they'd like to be or what their desired future looks like to them, and then they determine the steps that are needed to get there. Anne mentioned earlier one of Bryson's most popular books, The Strategic Planning for Public and Nonprofit Organizations. If you're interested in looking at some of his other work, he does have some more recent things. He has a workbook that was published in 2011 that looks at some more of the nuts and bolts related to the process itself. We also wanted the respondents of the survey to talk to us a little bit about if they always use the same framework when they're facilitating a strategic planning process, or if they might change it up or adapt it or alter it depending on the group that they're working with. And interestingly, but not surprisingly, well over half of those surveyed indicated that they don't necessarily use the same framework with every group. And of course, it's practices like these that both allow Extension to be responsive and offer a dynamic planning process, but at the same time, that does contribute to the difficulty of identifying and cataloging and reporting some of these activities. These are some of the other interesting pieces of information that we learned from the survey. More than 80% confirmed that facilitating a strategic planning process for a group or community takes a lot of time. Well, that's not surprising for the 80% of folks on the call here who indicated that they have facilitated. And nearly all of those folks, 95%, indicated that although the time commitment was large, the payoff for the group or community is well worth the effort and the investment. About 19% of those responding to the survey don't believe that the clientele involved in the strategic planning process is reflective of the demographics of the communities that they're representing. So in those cases, underrepresentation might be related to race or ethnicity, language barriers, lack of availability, economic factors. And finally, it's again no surprise to learn that all of the survey respondents indicated that this process, which is a very highly engaged process, builds a sense of ownership and responsibility for leading to shared vision and a shared sense of responsibility among the participants. After distilling the information from the focus groups and the literature review and our web-based survey, our team believes that a wide range of approaches to strategic planning is really a strength for the Extension system. These varying processes allow us to be more adaptive and responsive, and to customize our educational strategy based on whatever the group happens to be that we're working with and is reflective of whatever their particular needs are, ranging from whatever it is that they want to achieve to even perhaps the funding that they have available to help support an effort like this. So this diversity of approaches also provides us with a process that's broad and deep, and allows us to have resources and experiences to employ within our national system. So some of the recommendations that our team came up with from the collected information include things that are focused around mainly the last question that I mentioned earlier. This question really sort of guided our study, and the question was, how can we strengthen Extension's role in empowering communities and organizations through strategic planning processes? And we believe that a toolbox of resources, perhaps maintained online, would provide a comprehensive library of not only research-based information that could be used to develop strategic planning processes, but could also opportunities for further study, for dialogue, for skill development among extension professionals across the country. We also noted that in addition to the specific planning process, general information and experiential opportunities to develop skills related to facilitation are also needed. The web-based toolbox we felt could also provide examples of strategic plans that had been executed. So, examples of plans that had already been processed through and written, as well as strategies to identify and collect outcomes and impacts from the strategic planning efforts facilitated by Extension. This kind of impact documentation, as Anne just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, is essential and allows for additional reporting and allows us to more effectively dialogue with stakeholders and policymakers. Inherently, we know that strategic planning is a valuable planning and development tool. And we believe that our clientele also understand the value of this process for putting their groups and communities on a path to success. Our challenge is to continue to explore ways to document this success, both in numbers, as Anne said, both in the outcomes, but also in the value-laden experiences, so we continue to move forward with innovative and effective ways to engage groups and communities in this worthwhile process. Anne and I, on behalf of our teams, wanted to be sure that we thanked NCRCRD for their support of this project. And we are happy to answer any questions that you might have had along the way.
Thanks, Anne and Becky. For those in the audience or the participants, if you have some questions, you can add them to the chat section, and then we'll respond. I see Kelly is typing right now. As we were talking about strategic planning, I was thinking about my wife, who is a counselor, and sometimes she refers to helping people go from one state to another state, and sort of the life coach thing. And it's like it's hard enough with just a person to facilitate, empowering them to transition to get where they want to go, and then to think about doing it for an entire community. What a challenge, isn't it?
I think it's a challenge, and as we worked with our colleagues across the country, there's so many interesting examples of strategic planning, and Becky and I, we laughed about this, but you could also cry about this, where you get called in to do what they call strategic planning, and then you arrive and find out that it's a group where they haven't been able to talk with one another for the last I don't know how many years, and they think you're going in there to do something quite different from what they've described it. So that is a case example of where, as an extension person, you really have to look to see where is this group functioning now, and do they have good methods of communication? Are the issues out in the open and available? Are they dealing with the right issues, or are they stuck on something? And even in those cases, the strategic planning process can be useful because it creates kind of a safe avenue for people to begin to surface issues in a way that the group can address them and get beyond some of the sticking points that they haven't been able to work past previously. So it really speaks to the flexibility that our colleagues were saying that they needed to be able to arrive and plan with the group and say, okay, here's where we're going to start, and here's a reasonable and effective process for you to move forward. So yeah, it is kind of when you said counseling, you think that we shouldn't be doing counseling, but sometimes it feels like you're counseling people to use a better process at least.
Yeah. Well, you have several questions from Kelly and Greg and Sandra and
Well, Kelly's question is the one I saw first, and that reminds me that this process was initiated because we have an old and creaky online strategic planning tool at the University of Illinois that we've used for years. And although it still works well, the web development group up here keeps telling me that the programming language is so old that it really presents a security risk, so we have to update it. So part of our purpose and looking at what would people like to be able to use was to update that tool. And I think that the next phase for us working on this is to look at that tool and maybe make it an upgraded, more modern tool that is available across the region. It is available across the region right now, but it's just hosted by the University of Illinois. So that's kind of a long way to say, yes, I hope so, Kelly. We are working to look at that tool and make it better.
there's another question from Greg. Do you see that? And then Sandra.
Greg, you mean printing? You mean printing this PowerPoint that we used here today? Yeah, that'll be. Don't you guys
Yeah, we'll
make
make
that
that available.
available, Mark? Yeah,
Yes.
and the resources that were listed in the chat box. People did suggest some additional books, and I think that those are useful for those of us to look at what they're finding helpful. So yes and yes.
There are two additional questions, one from Rainey on the and one from a guest. I'm not sure who that is. I hope I'm saying Rainey that correctly.
Ronnie asked about participants being reflective of the community. That's one of those topics that I think where Extension has an important role to play in a community, helping them in the preliminary phases of creating these stakeholder groups or a steering committee or whatever you want to call it that will guide the planning process. So it's almost pre-planning planning, working with the community to see what are the demographics here, what are the groups that are affected, who should be at the table, and how do we get them there. And it's somewhat, I think, dependent on their trust in your ability to do something after they make the effort to plan and make decisions. Is anything going to happen? And then somewhat dependent on the issues that are addressed. Are these meaningful issues for the community, or is it just the same old stuff that isn't inspiring people to participate? So a lot of this pre-planning gets into the way that communities have engaged all the stakeholders in decision making, how those issues are framed, how they facilitate the discussion. So yeah, there's I think a huge role for Extension to guide those community processes so that they're fair and inclusive and that they provide a voice to people based on their interest in the issue and where they are, not just who they are in the community.
I agree, and it may be important for us to help educate community leaders or organization leaders about the importance of having participation at all levels in the community from a variety of different folks representing a lot of different things, helping those community leaders or organization leaders see the value in bringing in folks from all walks of life to be a part of the process.
Well, I wonder if now is a good time to sort of close off the session. We try to keep them, not too long so people can move on and still get that really good information on the webinar. Um, so thank you very much, Ann and Becky. Really appreciate it and very useful.
Thank you
Thank you, Mark.
for funding our
Appreciate the
project.
opportunity.
Well, I'm glad to take some credit for it. I know that that isn't fully fair of me to do so, though.
Well, you can fund the next phase.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining in.